The most common questions I get about renting.
So my stance is and has always been that if you are a tenant, you really want to do your best to move up into being a homeowner at some point in your life. It really does benefit your financial disposition to become a homeowner at some point. But with that said, if you are a tenant, you still have rights, and you should know your rights, and you should know that you have rights, but you do know the details. So with that being said, I'm going to go over a couple of things that you should know as a tenant. So the 48-hour notice is when your landlord is going to enter your property. They have to, by law, give you 48 hours notice prior to entering. They do not need to ask for permission. They only need to give you that 48-hour notice. And keep in mind, if they do think there's an emergency in your unit, in your property that you are leasing, they do at that point have a right to enter without notice as well. They typically will try to call you, but if there's no answer or they can't get a hold of you, they can enter the property in an emergency situation. So discrimination is an interesting topic. Technically, it's not that you're not allowed to discriminate, it's that you can't discriminate against certain protected classes. So the important part to know is, what are those protected classes? So the US government and the Fair Housing Act, they prohibit discrimination against race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. So those are all pretty easy to understand. I think the one that most people confuse is familial status. The reason is that familial status basically is if you have kids or if you don't have kids, you can't discriminate against any of those. Now, if you feel like you have been discriminated for one of those reasons, then that's something that you would report to Fair Housing. Being that I am practicing in Arizona, we do follow those protected classes. Other states have additional protected classes that you would have to look more into if you're in that state. One thing that commonly comes up is pets and service animals. So what constitutes a service animal in order to basically force a property manager or landlord to allow your pet in the property that you want to rent? And there are some details, and even new details that have come out as recent as March of this year, 2020. And I'll state a couple of those and then allow you the direct link to go and find and elaborate on the information yourself, because there are a lot of details to this subject matter. So the first thing is, you can always, and I recommend that you look at the details at the HUD.gov website. And beyond that, the most important parts, or the things that come up the most often, are what constitutes a service animal. Well, there's actually two categories. One is a service animal, and two is a support animal. So as a service animal, it's a dog that is trained to work or perform a task. And this is something that is described from the Americans with Disability Act, or ADA. Now, the second part, the support animal, that's described as animals that do work, perform a task, or assist and provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals. Now, it goes a little bit further, and with that, they offer a little bit more guidance with this definition. A support animal constitutes an animal that is also commonly kept in a home for pleasure. So for example, a dog, a cat, small bird, things like that. If the individual or the renter requests a unique animal, the burden is on that person to demonstrate a disability that's related therapeutically to need that unique animal. Lastly, one of the most important things is proving that you have a need for a service animal or a support animal. And that documentation basically can't just be something printed off the internet, which is what people were doing often. You do have to prove that you are in need of a service animal or support animal. Many times there's a doctor involved in that process, but let me redirect you to HUD.gov in order to get more details because it's actually a pretty long document, about 19 pages. So if you'd like further information, take a look at the details there. In the meantime, this just kind of quickly answers some of the most relevant and most often asked questions. So what are all the typical fees? Well, this is one of the reasons why I tell people it's not always cheaper to rent. Actually, a lot of times it's more expensive. So when you're buying a house, a lot of times you can get down payment assistance, and you can also sometimes get the seller to pay for closing costs. So it can be quite affordable. With rent, depending on the landlord, there's quite a few fees that add up to be quite a bit sometimes. With that, let's go through them. So you have your standard earnest money deposit that holds the property for you. Now with that earnest money deposit, that a lot of times, if you move forward and sign the lease, will act as a credit towards your other cost. Those other costs being security deposits, which by law they can ask for up to 1.5 months rent as a security deposit. There's other non-refundable deposits, including but not limited to things like cleaning fees, pet fees, things like that add up, as well as first and last month's rent. So when you add all that up, that's a big chunk of change. But keep in mind, those are all the typical fees that you would need to put down in order to rent a property. So keep that in mind and think about buying a house soon. Now, since there's no way to touch on all the different questions people might have about being a tenant and the laws, I have to guide you to the most important document you'll ever need as a tenant, and that is the Landlord Tenant Act. That is a 47-page document of how tenants and owners / landlords / property managers should interact. There's laws that are guide these interactions and you have to abide by. So with that being said, and the easiest way to get a copy of that is at housing.az.gov, but you're not going to remember that when you need it. So it's really simple to just Google Landlord Tenant Act, and then you should be able to pull up a copy of it in order to help guide you if you're having any issues. A lot of people who call me and ask me questions about properties that they're renting or just the process or any kind of legal questions, I don't do property management, so it's not something that I intimately read all the time like I do in residential sales. So I always guide them to this Landlord Tenant Act in order for them to know the laws, know how to abide by the laws, and also make sure that the owner, landlord, property manager is abiding by those laws as well.